Hi there, and welcome to Next Frontier. My name is Thomas Andersen, founder and CEO of Responsibly, and Next Frontier is my show about sustainability in the supply chain. Today I'm talking to Luká Yancopoulos. Luká has a fascinating story. He got into the procurement space and specifically the medical supply chain during COVID. He saw problems that I think many of us did back then of how difficult it was to get your hands on personal protective equipment, also known as PPE. And like any great entrepreneur, instead of just reading about it, he sought to fix it by starting a charitable organization called the Pandemic Relief Supply to essentially help procure protective equipment. That was his first foray into the medical supply chain and procurement, and later led him to start Grapevine Technologies and dive even deeper into the space. Now, Next Frontier is a podcast about supply chain sustainability, not procurement of medical devices, but the medical sector provides a fascinating case story of some supply chain sustainability issues or optimization potential, depending on what mood you're in, that applies to most industries. And it's all about waste. So, Luká and I dive deep on two things in particular. The first waste issue is related to middlemen and how damaging middlemen can be on the LCA emissions of the products you buy, due to the simple fact that goods get shipped around again and again and again between distributors before they end up with the actual buyer. So, going direct is not just a cost lever, but it's also a sustainability lever. And I do love it when those two align. The second waste issue is related to inventory management. The medical sector is a fascinating example of an industry where you simply end up ordering a lot more than you actually need, purely due to bad inventory management, i.e. you're buying stuff that you already have on stock. Buying more that you don't use equals waste, which equals more cost, which equals more emissions. So again, inventory management is one of those beautiful examples of a business case where sustainability and cost optimization can be fully aligned. Okay, Luká Yancopoulos, founder and CEO of Pandemic Relief Supply and Grapevine Technologies. Here we go. Hey, Luká.
Hey there, Thomas.
Hey, it's good to see you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Awesome.
How about yourself?
Very good, thank you. You're based in New York, right?
Yes, I am based in New York, and the sun is actually just peeking out. I'm seeing the cloudy skies in your background, but our sun is coming out maybe to warm us up. We've been getting teased between the seasons here as summer's winding down and the weather's getting a little colder, but today's shaping out to be a beautiful day here in New York.
Ah, that's nice. Yeah, we're not quite there, but you know, it's Denmark. We're used to it. But
Yeah.
what are you from New York originally, or?
I'm born and raised in the state of New York, although
Okay.
a true New Yorker would be able to tell quite easily that I wasn't born and raised in New York City. I grew up an hour and a half north of here in the farm and cow country of New York, which oftentimes people are surprised to hear we even have in the great state of New York. But I only recently made the move in the last couple of years down into the Big Apple, New York City.
Okay, how far away is it where you grew up from New York City?
About 90-minute drive.
Okay, that's pretty close.
Yeah, New York, a lot of the American states, I think Europeans often hear about it, right? Everyone has a car in America, you got to drive sort of everywhere. New York is one of the few major cities where you can walk almost everywhere. And there isn't really this idea of urban sprawl where the city goes on for hundreds of kilometers. It really has we're on an island here in Manhattan, right? So the city erupts out of the water, and then it disappears as you go over those bridges and rapidly becomes this sort of cow country.
That's funny. I've never been outside of the city. I've never seen the cows. Maybe one day.
Well, if next time you're here, I'd love to show you that cow country. You can see how it compares to Denmark has, I think, more of a reputation of the beautiful countryside than New York definitely gets, but we'll see the behind the scenes next time you're here.
Do you guys have any mountains, or is it flat? Like, I have no idea what the geography is.
I would say, they call them mountains, but they're not mountains by your standards.
Well, we don't have any. That's
really?
our neighbors, Norway.
Okay.
our tallest point, Luca, I kid you not, it's called Sky Mountain.
Yeah,
Guess how tall it is?
I'm doing a quick translation of meters. Above sea level, what, like 2,000 meters?
160 something meters.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. No.
It's
So
like it's a pathetic hill and it's called Sky Mountain. It's
I,
hilarious.
I guess then by your standards, hell yeah, we've got mountains.
You got mountain. Nice. That's
We're
good.
getting a couple 1,000-foot mountains, but nothing like, nothing like the Alps or things in Norway or whatever.
No. That's nice. But awesome, Luca. It's so good to see you and welcome to Next Frontier.
Thanks for having me, Thomas. I'm very excited to be here.
Absolutely, and I'm super excited to talk to you today because you are very specialized in the medical supply chain, right? And I think
Yeah.
the medical supply chain is quite fascinating, and I guess especially recently, right? Like you must have been working at one of the more fascinating times in that industry, with the pandemic and everything happening there, right? There must be some war stories, I guess, from those days.
I mean, absolutely. I was a senior in college at university when the pandemic happened, and it was really our call to action to get involved. My mom's a nurse practitioner. My dad's a medical doctor and scientist.
Hmm.
Um, and we were driving ourselves crazy, a bunch of college kids in our dorm room, quarantining and taking classes online all of a sudden. And we were scared about the well-being of our family members and whatnot, and we wanted to help out. So we started it just as a project to help these people, and it rapidly became a business as we started getting interest from major healthcare distributors that are multi-hundred-year-old sort of companies. So it was a crazy time to get started, but a good
Hmm.
motivation to make a positive impact when there's a very clear and obvious need, and you got time on your hands and nothing but your own mind to drive you crazy. So
Yeah, absolutely. Was that how you got into supply chain, or was it kind of even before that, or what's the story there?
that was absolutely my foray on supply chains period. Before that, I was studying, and I ended up finishing a degree in environmental science at
Hmm.
UPenn, and then also biomedical engineering. So I got 2 degrees from there, and that was my focus. So I was coding computer chips and plugging them into the brain of a cockroach to make the cockroach write my name with its hand, right? Like that's
No
the sort of
way.
stuff that we were up to at school and in my major. And then supply
Wow.
chains hit, and I was like, wait a minute, maybe these cockroaches aren't so important.
That's fascinating. So I guess one of the better outcomes of the pandemic is it got people like you focusing on how can we make that supply chain behind the medical industry a bit more efficient.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I had personally things taken away from me, right? I was working in a research lab on campus, and they shut down the lab, right?
Mhm.
Because we didn't have masks, we couldn't follow the procedures. I mean, it was insane. And similarly, biotechnology companies that were working on cures, right, to COVID, they were getting shut down due to supply chain disruption. Hospitals, right? I've got stories from my mom, horror stories of surgeons having to put a garbage bag over their head and chest to use it as a gown, right, to perform a life-saving surgery because they didn't have
Damn.
sterile surgical gowns, right? So it was a thing that you couldn't really shake or look away from, no matter who you were, whether you're a doctor, a patient, a scientist, a college student, a researcher. Those supply chain disruptions, had a huge impact on the day-to-day and the lifestyle of everyone.
Yeah. And the organization that you guys ended up creating there was that focused on PPE, protective equipment?
Yeah, it was mostly focused on PPE, that original sort of project, and we basically were compiling U.S. import records, which are published by our government, alongside the FDA medical device sort of license database,
Hmm.
seeing who's importing FDA licensed supplies, these alternative suppliers, and then just connecting those importers directly to consumers of these supplies or medical practices that needed them. And it wasn't a business model or anything. It was just handing off communications and contacts so people could stand up supply chains. In the US, the healthcare supply chains, I mean, it's about on medical supplies, on drugs, it's a $500 billion market, or $500 billion spent on those supplies each year.
Wow.
And there are companies that are doing, like, major players. So maybe 60-70% of that is run through a few major distributors, people like McKesson, people
Hmm.
like, Cardinal Health, AmerisourceBergen, right? But when so much of the there's so many of the medical practices depend on so few major distributors, a disruption at one of those major companies can take down half of the hospitals, right, in America, which is very scary and makes us very vulnerable. There's not a lot of diversification when it comes to, oh, I work with 20 suppliers, I work with 50 different suppliers as a hospital, even though I'm buying thousands of unique SKUs, thousands of different drugs, right? It's a scary thing, and it really exacerbated the problem here. So our ability to basically find specialty importers, the smaller guys who are ultimately reselling to these major distributors, and connect them directly to the end users made things a lot more dynamic for the hospitals, allowed them to get supplies that they needed when the distributors were having, local shortages and whatnot. And it was a cool start to our journey.
That's super fascinating. And, we talked a little bit beforehand, right? Because what we really want to dive into is, how do we think about sustainability in the medical industry, and, what are some of the problems there? And it's basically all about waste, right? And I guess both waste related to logistics and waste related to, just not using the products. So how did that pan out in the pandemic, and with all of these kind of single-use items being ordered and so on?
Yeah, so I think our experience during the pandemic, I think, really exemplifies the problems. I mean, we were studying those problems, and we were a part of the problems, right? But it gave us an opportunity to see things before taking a step back and launching what we now do today, a company called Grapevine. At a certain point, right, after we're connecting the dots, connecting the importers directly to the medical practices, at a certain point, we end up getting a phone call from one of these massive distributors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they say, hey, we hear you're servicing our customers with medical supplies. We'd like to start buying supplies from you. Say, okay. And we, go online, register an LLC, a company, and set up a bank account. And they start sending us orders. This is one of the biggest companies in America. They start sending us orders for millions and millions of masks and different types of PPE, right? Mm-hmm. And what do? Well, we then send out an order to the importers, bring it into our warehouse. We then send it to, the major distributor's warehouse. They then forward that to 5 different warehouses, and then they ship it, ultimately to the medical practice, right? We're talking about 5, 6 different incidences of shipping this after it enters the US borders, shipping it to 5 or 6 different warehouses all around America, right? Before it ends up going out to the end user. These are unnecessary shipments, right? That every time you ship something, right, the carbon output is embodied by that product, right? Mm-hmm. It may have taken however many, it creates problems every time we ship it, every time we transport something from A to B, B to C. It's increasing the output that can be assigned to that specific product, and that's a huge problem. So that led us to one of the changes that we've now made in healthcare supply chains for our customers here at Grapevine, which is disintermediation, right? If there are unnecessary middlemen, whether that's a business or a warehouse, cutting out those unnecessary stops of supply, at different locations, unnecessary shipments of supplies, to reduce the ultimate emissions before a product gets in the hand of the person who's going to use it, right?
Oh, that's interesting. So basically, for some product categories, there's just so much carbon coming from the transport and all of the unnecessary stops before it reaches the end user, and it's due to fragmentation, it's due to middlemen, etc. Why do you think that happens? Like, why do we end up in that situation? Because it must also be costly, right, to transport something, unnecessarily again and again.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, our language over here is sort of those costs and trying to minimize those costs, right? Every time you ship a medical device, an implant, a drug, categories have different amounts that they'll, right? How much does an item cost? If it's really expensive, then the cost is going to increase less when you ship it. But if it's really, a lower cost item per pound, per volume, it's gonna increase cost greater. So something that we see, here at Grapevine is every time you ship a medical device, it's raising the price about 20%, right? 13 to 20% is pretty typical. So talking about compounding that 5-6 times, there's the price of products is or the cost of products is basically doubling by shipping it that number of times. And yeah, you could think about it in dollars, you can think about it in carbon, but either way, it's inefficiencies that must be, bypassed. It's totally irresponsible that they're even happening in the first place. And it's because we're relying on outdated systems, outdated supply chain structures. And in a space like healthcare, the risks of changing, and evolving are scary, right? Because there are lives at stake. And if a change doesn't go so well, right, the ultimate outcome could be, a negative impact for patients or missing a life-saving procedure. And people don't like to change. We got a saying here in New York. It's, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? And I think that's especially true when the risks associated with the change are high.
Interesting. And it's also a good example of, how in sustainability, we often have this kind of association where we say, okay, for something to be more sustainable, it needs to cost more, right? So it pulls interest a little bit away from it. But in so many cases, it's about efficiency, and the footprint of something is very much related to the cost of producing it, the amount of waste, all of these things, right? So there's a very aligned business case with making it more sustainable because you make it more efficient, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think efficiency is one of those areas, absolutely, where costs and sustainability are beautifully aligned. And in a lot of times in people's minds, they think, like you said, you got to pay more for things to be more sustainable. But I think it's quite the opposite when you're talking about supply chains, and optimizing those supply chains to be in a healthier structure.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, part of it, as you say, is happening because the industry is just quite risk averse, quite old fashioned, analog, etc. What that happens when you guys interfere? Do you then become the middlemen, or do they connect directly to the suppliers? Like, how do you change that process?
Yeah, so I'll give you, our company is called Grapevine, and the experience that a user has is we're trying to balance exactly what you said, right? We're trying to balance sustainable, or increased efficiency, with sort of honoring the parts of a supply chain that medical practices sort of demand that we sort of keep in place and continue holding on to. So the experience for a Grapevine user is they sign up. It's totally free to use this platform. They click a button in the top right corner of our web application. It says link suppliers, and they can type in their sort of username and credentials to any of the suppliers that they work with in the healthcare space. It's usually, a handful of major distribution companies or middlemen. From that moment, all of the data, their contracted prices, flood into Grapevine. And when they click add to cart on their, habitual supplier's item, it'll say, wait, you can get this from another supplier at a cheaper cost. Or if there's a back order, why don't you get the same exact item from an alternative distributor, at a lower price? And that's sort of how our application works to drive down costs and to help avoid or bypass back orders in real time. And that's really our core focus. But we don't stop there, and I haven't really hit on the sustainability point yet. What we make possible is disintermediation by unlocking sort of the manufacturer, the first importer of those supplies, in the United States. So you're working with, let's just say, McKesson or Cardinal Health, one of these major distribution companies that does hundreds of billions of dollars of sales revenue each year. 60 to 70% of the products they're offering, they're actually buying from another US-based supplier, right? And then they bring them into their warehouse and they sell them off, right? And customers, medical practices, typically will go to one of these major distributors because it's easier to order from one place than it is, a dozen different places.
Yeah.
On Grapevine, we'll tell you when there's an opportunity to work directly with the manufacturer, the importer. Hey, this is one of those items that McKesson or AmerisourceBergen is reselling, right? Don't buy it from the reseller. Don't buy it from the guy who's already sort of output a ton of carbon shipping it to their warehouse. Start buying it now with the click of a button from the original source or the closest to the sources you can get. And by doing so, yeah, you're going to save a ton of money. You're going to save 60%, but you're also going to cut out the carbon output by, I don't know, probably like a full 50% too, I would guess. I mean, the shipping as far as carbon output is a huge contributor here in the US.
Yeah, and I guess when you move it inside the US, it's probably by trucks or plane or something, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Trucks, plane primarily, sometimes train, but more often trucks and plane.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And it sounds like it's also due to probably a big fragmentation on the supplier front, right? It must be difficult for a hospital to kind of know about all of these small suppliers all over the world.
Yeah, the major distributors, they don't make it easy to tell what's a product that they manufacture themselves and what's
Mm.
not. And even the stuff that has their brand name on it is often manufactured, by someone else, imported by someone else, right? And ultimately just ends up in their warehouse with their label on it. But I don't know if you guys have this in Copenhagen, but it's sort of like if you ever buy like a Coca-Cola can or a Fanta can, like some sort of soda can, and if
Hmm.
you peel off the label, you'll actually see underneath the Coca-Cola label, there might be like a Fanta label or I don't know, another
Really?
brand of beverage. Yeah, because they're basically buying overstock cans and reusing them because it's cheaper than, manufacturing them outright. It's a really crazy thing. So you can
No
peel
way.
off your
I've never done
lemonade
that.
label and get iced tea, and then you peel off the iced tea label and you'll get soda.
That's funny. I need to do that at some point. I've never heard about that before. Maybe it's a US thing, but I'll definitely
Yeah,
try.
yeah.
Okay, but that's interesting. And one of the other issues that we see with kind of that middleman problem is that, yes, there's the added distribution leg, but you also have the intransparency, right? So you don't know where those goods are actually coming from. You're not able to actually audit that supplier that makes it, understand their sustainability footprint. Everything is blind, right? There's a distributor, and then you don't know what happens behind the scenes.
Exactly. And the more that's going on behind the scenes, the more, complicated these supply chains are, right? Like it makes you as a consumer more vulnerable, right? Like I'm depending on so many unknowns. I've got so little transparency into what's going on behind the scenes. And in the event of disruption, right? Like not only do you not know the output, where there's inefficiencies, but if something goes wrong, right? They say a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And
Mhm.
when these major distributors depend on, 1,000 potentially weak links, it makes them vulnerable to really negatively impacting the customer. If you can create as a customer, as a consumer of these supplies in medical practice, if you can create more of a network rather than sort of a linear chain, you can make yourself, when one link breaks, you can swap in sort of a new link that makes you more resilient to disruption and failure and shortage and whatnot.
Fascinating. What about, the human rights element? Where does these supply chains stretch into? You mentioned, you could order directly from a small US supplier. How often do you actually end up receiving goods from overseas?
I think more than 50% of medical FDA like licenses that are issued to manufacturers, more than 50% of those FDA licenses are to overseas manufacturers, right? So in the US, most of the supplies are coming from um, other countries. They're imported, right? Once they're imported, they're brought to these major warehouses or major distributor warehouses, and then resold
Mm.
in the US and in at least like the medical world. I think a lot of the sort of like exploration and accountability of human rights and upholding standards is put onto, our government. We like to think that if the government's giving these people licenses, the government's, doing these sorts of things, then they're upholding, good humanitarian sort of conditions for their workers and whatnot. I
Mm.
don't know if that's naive of us. I think it is naive of us, but yeah, we sort of trust what comes into our country and hope that it's coming from sort of fair working conditions. And unfortunately, I think that's not often the case. And a huge number of those FDA medical license are pulled each year, whether that's because the the supplies, the medical devices aren't being made in a clean enough way, or because of humanitarian reasons. It's a
Mm.
challenge that we have, especially during pandemic sort of times, right, when borders are closed up and it's hard to get from place to A to B and monitor these sorts of things.
Yeah, 100%. Are you aware of scandals that's been with those kind of big distributors where some journalists have gone in and said, "Oh shit, this is going into the certain regions in China where there's a lot of forced labor happening and stuff like that."
I'm not aware of those types of scandals. I mean, there are plenty of scandals. I am aware, but not in the sort of like humanitarian sort of like civil rights side. It's
Okay.
more like we've got monopoly rules. They call them like antitrust rules. Like businesses can't have monopolies on markets. They can't create anti-competitive sort of like commerce environments. And a lot of these major distributors in the healthcare space, it's all, public information, are being investigated by our federal government for violating, right, the antitrust sort of laws, the acting in a way that's anti-competitive and not allowing capitalism, and different businesses to innovate and compete in a healthy way. So these investigations are ongoing by the Federal Trade Commission, and those are scandals that I'm in tune with. But yeah, my knowledge dissipates as I go sort of into other countries and how the supply chain operates behind our borders.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay. But it's super interesting. We get it all the time at Responsibly where, and it's not isolated to the medical industry. It's any industry, right? You have a distributor that's delivering you, anything from ingredients to, whatnot. And as soon as you reach that distributor, you don't have transparency, right? So you're like, where does it come from? I don't know. How can I fulfill my due diligence requirements, etc. You need to work together with the distributor, but they often don't want to tell you where it came from and who the actual supplier is. And then you need to trust that they have the right due diligence programs in place. But it gets difficult, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Fascinating. Okay, so that's kind of the whole problem with the middlemen. But there's another sustainability problem in the medical industry, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing huge amounts of overstock at the medical practice, or contamination, of supplies that ultimately get basically thrown away, for lack of a better word. They get trashed because things in the healthcare space, you could imagine, a medication you might have, it has a shorter shelf life than, many commodities or plastics or whatever. And a lot of the thing, whether it's an implant that's going into someone's chest, right, or it's a drug that's going to be injected, or even the needle that's used, right, to perform that injection, these things, they must be sterile. They must be, like fresh off the press, and manufactured pretty recently. So things like humidity and whatnot don't affect them. And it's really important that that these supplies are used and monitored. I guess it's really important that medical practices have full visibility into what supplies they have on hand over an intricate floor plan and many storage cabinets and many exam rooms, right? They need to know what they have on hand, so that way they can use what they have on hand and it doesn't sit in a shelf, expire, and then get thrown away. And something like 30% of medical supplies that are purchased across drugs, devices and supplies are trashed every single year because medical practices have it, they order it, and it expires and they throw it away, right? So we see experiences like for a nurse or for a doctor, right? They go in to see a patient, they open the supply cabinet, it's not there. Maybe that supply that they really needed is one room over. Maybe it's down the hall, or maybe it's down in the storage room, but they're not aware of it. So after their appointment, they go back to their desk, they hop onto their computer, and they place an order for that item. Little do they know they had that supplies already. It's going to expire in a week. And now they're just ordering more supplies that they'll ultimately use in place of it. So expiring inventory is a huge issue, especially in the pharmacy and pharmaceutical space. And it's something that we hope to solve with passive monitoring of supplies, right? So letting people see all of their inventory across all the places they may store it without someone counting it, and then making them aware of what they've got across their various storage cabinets and storage rooms every time they're going to shop. So like, wait a minute, should you really order more? Or should you just use what's on floor 3? Take the elevator up, go grab it, you'll get it sooner, and you won't have to throw it away. So it's an interesting other problem, but expiring inventory leads to a huge amount of waste in the space.
It really is. And it's back to, I think another misconception about sustainability is that, we need to make physical changes, right? We need to design the products to be more sustainable. We need to make them recyclable, all of these things. And it's not about software, but what we forget is that we're just so incredibly inefficient that if we just kind of have better basic inventory management and we don't throw away stuff, then suddenly we can kind of reduce the footprint by 20-30%, as you say.
Exactly. And it's both with sustainability and even and to your point earlier, costs, right? Like in the US, we hear a lot about like controlling the prices or high drug prices, right, for patients, and how the costs of medical care are so exorbitantly high. I agree completely. They are way too high, right? Like when as a patient, I go to a doctor's appointment, I have the flu and I get an IV, I'm like shocked by the bill that I'm seeing. But as someone who works in this supply chain, I know that we don't need to necessarily, restrict what prices drug companies can sell these drugs at. Half of the price, right, that we ultimately pay as a patient is coming from inefficiencies. They need to cover, like the hospitals need to cover the overhead of all the shit that they buy and throw away, right? The hospitals need to cover the overhead of shipping that product 5 times. They're not even a part of those inefficiencies, but shipping that product 5 times before it gets to the patient. That's insane. And when we have these inefficiencies, like I truly believe we can cut I mean, we have for major oncology institutes, like national healthcare sort of organizations, we've cut their spend on these supplies by more than 60%, right? We're talking about tens of millions of dollars that they can either reduce patient bills by, right, or reallocate to making better medical technology and better patient care in a way that's ultimately going to serve the patient better. So I think that the answer to lowering healthcare costs in the U.S. is as much a question of making things more efficient, which is often left out of the conversation. And by making things more efficient, you make things more sustainable, and it's really like a win-win-win. There doesn't need to be a loser in this equation, at least in my mind.
And why isn't this happening? Like with the middlemen, we talk about it's fragmentation. It's difficult to kind of have a full grasp of the entire market. Inventory management. Can't any hospital hire an analyst and start doing more accurate forecasting and so on?
I mean, I think getting the data passively is a huge problem for hospitals. And this idea, like I got 2 sort of ideas. One, saving money shouldn't cost money, right? And saving time shouldn't cost time, right? When we say, oh, well, why don't you guys manage your inventory better? They say, okay, so I need to assign a new person to go from room to room and count things, right? And put it down on a piece of paper and then plug that into, your data system. And that is costing me time to ultimately maybe save money and time. And when they have to weigh a cost and a benefit to decide if it's something they want to engage with, that's a tough decision. And as a provider of anything, I don't want to be asking that of our people. So the systems that we hope to build related to inventory management should cost them no time, right? It's a combination of hardware, recording devices, both like weighing devices and camera and image recognition sort of software that plugs in and passively tracks all of this, inventory on their behalf. I think where people struggle is finding the data, recording the quantities in each storage room, plugging that into a system and keeping it accurate. It's hard, and it's a position that isn't built out in the medical space at medical practices, and it's a weird thing for them to hire, right? These aren't supply chain guys. They're doctors. They care about patient care. They don't care about, optimizing a supply chain, and it's a few too many steps away, the patient efficiency or the saving money and something more abstract like, inventory management that it's hard for them to wrap their mind around. So as a entrepreneur, as, a business that hopes to provide great value, we need to make this an obvious, a no effort, no cost sort of decision for them. It just has benefits.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I guess here there's a logistics element as well, right? I remember, when we built my previous company and we did logistics in Australia, there was a big inventory management thing there, because if you're not good at managing your inventory, you order things last minute and you fly them in, by plane. And that has a huge footprint to it, right? If you're very good at managing your inventory, you ship it by sea. And even if you kind of go from between, cities in Australia, instead of moving it by truck, you can move it by a boat. But you just need to be able to plan ahead, right? Because it takes longer. And I guess hospitals must be flying in stuff all the time.
100%. And it's crazy how many times like an order can be placed, right, for a product. They don't realize that product's not in stock at their supplier's warehouse, right? And then a week goes by, they now have a surgery and they go, okay, give me the implant, let's put it into this guy's chest. And it's not there, right? So now they're panicking, and like you said, whatever the surgery might be in 48 hours, so they're flying it in. It's insane the amount of waste that goes into that. And being able to sort of forecast your need before you actually need it is a huge part of, I think, driving efficiency. And for us, I mean, the sea freight isn't really an element, but it's the same conversation of trucks versus planes,
Yeah.
right? Oh, can it get there in 3 to 5 days? And if you really can forecast further out, you could even use a train, which is going to be more efficient, right? So
Yeah.
if you can forecast a few weeks out, you can drive huge efficiencies, both related to cost and sustainability, reducing a footprint by being able to plan a little bit better. And it's weird. There's this culture of sort of like just-in-time inventory needs. Do they talk about it much in Copenhagen and in your world and your supply chains? Because
Yeah, I think it's one of the big kind of supply chain topics, right? And I think it's human, right? It's like my fridge. My fridge is pretty just in time, right? I never know what's in my fridge. I just go buy it, you know.
yeah.
I could have better demand forecasting for what I need to buy at the supermarket.
Yeah. I mean, that'd be great. My fridge is sort of plugged in. It tells me when things are going bad and it reorders it as I need. I mean, that'd be cool and all. But if we could predict it out a couple of weeks, right? Oh, it's expiring in a few days. This milk is either going to get drank or it's going to get gone in one way or another. I mean, that would be huge to be able to take a little slower approach to getting my supplies in, a little more efficient, a little more sustainable.
And I know a lot of the companies like Samsung are working on it, right? Like, can we put a camera in the fridge and then kind of see what you have in there and then use that to create recipes and so on? I guess it's almost the same way you're thinking about medical supplies.
Yeah, it is. It's not very different at all.
Are we there yet? Like for that to be realized?
Unfortunately, have you heard of the Just Walk Out Amazon stores?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever been to one, but I have here in New York. Virtually all of them here in New York have closed down. So
Really?
yeah, and you as a retailer, you could license, and I think you still can license both the hardware, right, and the software from Amazon to make your store, any store, into a Just Walk Out, whatever store. It costs like $200,000, right? Which is not practical for a medical practice that's spending, maybe $200,000 a year on medical supplies. Why would they? And it's a much more complicated layout. Like I said, many exam rooms, many places to store things. It's not neat organized shelves. So
True.
the combination of the cost that Amazon is charging retailers with the frequent, and you can look it up, it's all over the news, all their stores sort of shutting down, tells me that we are not there just yet. I think that Grapevine will be there in the next 5 years, but the Amazons of the world are not there just yet. And I think the tech isn't there just yet. I think it's going to need some real disruptors to come into the space and change the game and play a little smarter to really get things to where they need to be. And hopefully we're one of those groups.
Fantastic. That's fascinating, Luca. Anything else going on in the medical supply chain that's interesting from a sustainability perspective?
I mean, something that I'm interested in related to sustainability and medical supply chains, but I don't know much about is sort of the biological and hazardous waste, right? Whether it's chemotherapy doused, needles and syringes, or it's, blood covered, gloves, or whatever it may be. I'm sure that there are massive inefficiencies related to how that waste is sort of handled, how it's processed, how it's, probably dumped into landfills and whatnot. And that's something that disturbs me. It's something that I would like to know more about. I'd like to be a part of the solution, and is that sort of waste management, which is just about the least sexy thing you could do in tech, waste management. But for some reason, it's captured my eye.
Yeah, well, the least sexy things are always fun, right? I never thought I would build a company around trucking in Australia. That didn't sound very sexy, but I'm telling you, every time I drive down the roads these days, I'm still, biased by I know what truck type it is. I can't help shut up about it.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, it's usually those unsexy systems. They don't get as much attention as, something like a Chat GPT, but that also means that because there's not a lot of attention, there's not a lot of eyes on it, there's not a lot of minds focused on improving those systems. Those are the systems that create opportunities for big change and huge impact. It's the places that are less explored and less understood and less optimized. So I find the non-sexy things sometimes the most interesting.
100%. I fully agree. All right, Luca, this was amazing. Any words you want to leave listeners with? Let's say you're a buyer or you are a sustainability professional and you recognize these things with waste in kind of the inventory, things you throw out, etc. How do they get started on that journey?
I think it's really important to make sustainability a very easy yes, right? If you have an idea, a new gadget, whatever it is, it can't be, oh, well, there's a cost associated with adopting sustainable practices, but there's this benefit that's the environment. You don't want, right, people to have to give up something to engage with sustainability. You want them to just say, well, it's better in every way and it's more sustainable. So why wouldn't I do it, right? It'd be crazy not to do it. So it shouldn't cost money to be more sustainable. It shouldn't cost time or energy to be more sustainable. And this is the responsibility of entrepreneurs and leadership in technology and innovation, right? We need to make sustainability married to the other things that businesses or consumers are looking for. So that way, everyone just says yes to sustainability, right? And there are a lot of ways to do that. And until we solve all those problems, until we make the easy parts of sustainability obvious, right? It's a lot harder to get, people who have their own interests, their own greed, their own, motivations to say yes. So let's start on the stuff we can all agree on, because there's plenty of opportunity to increase sustainability in just that way. And I think that's a lesson that everyone from legislatures to, innovators should be thinking about as we try to make the world a more sustainable place.
Awesome. I think that's one of the arguments that will be easier for the CFO to agree with. So that's definitely helpful. Fantastic. Absolutely. Luká, thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for coming on Next Frontier.
Thanks for having me, Thomas. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. If you're still here, then first of all, thank you so much for listening. If you've got thoughts about this episode or what you'd like to hear more of, you can email us at thomas@nextfrontier.earth. We really do read every email. You can also hit me up directly on LinkedIn. Just search for Thomas Buch Andersen. That's Thomas B-U-C-H Andersen. If you feel like it, please share with your friends and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcast. We also have a YouTube channel. It's on @NextFrontierEarth if you want to see what we actually look like in person. And if you really love the show, hit us with that 5-star review. Today's episode was produced and edited by Christina Soto, and Next Frontier music is by Keyhole. See you next time.